Thank you, Victoria. Good morning or good afternoon to all of you. I will take you through the main findings of the report on the modernization of the Energy Charter Treaty. For those of you who are not familiar with the treaty, I will first give you an overview of the original objectives of this treaty, which was designed in 1991 and entered into force in 1998. It had originally three main objectives. One of them is political objective, which was to overcome divisions between Western and Eastern Europe by building European energy market and an East-West energy policy forum. We have to keep in mind that the treaty, given that it was designed in 1991, it was just after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The second objective is related to the energy security, and basically it was based on ensuring continuous supply of fossil fuels to Western Europe from the East, given that Western Europe is energy dependent. The third objective is an economic objective, which was related to ensuring the flow of Western investment in the energy sector in the East through binding investment protection provisions. I will come back to the provisions in the treaty later. By January 2020, 53 countries have ratified the treaty and the European Union Euratom. Now, if we look at these three objectives, I will start with the first one, which is the political objective. This objective became the raison d'etre, which was actually the real raison d'etre of the treaty. It became obsolete in 2009 with the withdrawal of Russia from the provisional application of the ECT. Russia has never ratified the treaty, but some of the provisions were applicable in Russia as well. In parallel to that, in the last 20 years, what happened is that several treaties or partnerships have been put in place, especially under the lead of the European Union, like, for example, the Energy Community Treaty, which aim at building a European energy market. So basically, not only that the first raison d'etre or the main raison d'etre, which was having Russia in the loop from energy perspective, with the withdrawal of Russia became obsolete, but the ECT today, with all the existing partnerships, overlaps with all the new partnerships. It overlaps with these partnerships and treaties. So from the European perspective, basically today the ECT is useful for 5 countries, member signatories of the treaty: Afghanistan, Australia, Jordan, Mongolia, and Yemen. However, these countries are not big players in the global energy dialogue, especially in a warming planet. So basically the ECT failed in meeting its political objective. Second objective, as I mentioned earlier, is related to energy security. However, once again, with the withdrawal of Russia in 2009, the ECT became obsolete in terms of supplying Europe with fossil fuels. This is from 2018. And what we see is that Norway, among all ECT signatories, Norway is the main supplier of fossil fuels to Europe, mainly for oil and gas, and Australia for coal. However, Norway is a member of the European Free Trade Area. We have special partnership with Norway and all these countries in this area. And Australia, the supply of coal is going to be lower and lower in Europe, given the phase-out plans that we European countries are developing for coal. And then, in terms of from economic perspective, the third objective of the ECT was to ensure the flow of investment from Western Europe, the EU, to non-EU countries. And what we see here, this is for the period 2013-2019. The investment in non-EU countries is very low, and most of the investment the foreign direct investment are in the EU countries, and mainly intra-EU investment actually. This means that most likely in the flow of energy investment is not driven by the ECT. Instead, it's driven by the EU energy policies and mainly the internal market regulations. So basically, the ECT failed in meeting its 3 objectives: the political one with the withdrawal of Russia, the energy security contributing to the energy of security with the withdrawal of Russia, and the economic objective with the lack of flow of energy investment in non-EU countries. Now, if we look at the provisions that are in the ECT, we have two types of provisions. Part of the provisions are binding provisions, and the second part are non-binding provisions. The binding provisions are related only to supply side, oil, coal, gas, nuclear, and electricity. And what makes the ECT powerful is the investor-to-state dispute settlement, which are settled in private arbitration outside the national laws. And I will come back to these ISDS cases. And then the non-binding provisions include energy efficiency and environmental protection, despite the fact that the ECT is, to my knowledge, the only international agreement which considers energy savings as an energy source on its own. Provisions on energy efficiency are not binding under the ECT, which makes the ECT useless in terms of reducing the demand, reducing energy demand. And then now, in terms of ISDS cases, the main issue raised by which makes the ECT powerful is we have, after more than 2 decades of the existence of energy of the ECT, we have in total 130 ISDS claims, out of which 88 are against the EU and its member states. What we see here are all the claims against the EU and its member states, and we see that Spain is the main victim of ECT. Spain has is facing 48 ISDS claims, and while Netherlands is the host state for the vast majority of the claimants, investors claiming compensation under the ECT against other EU countries. Importantly, in 2019, we had for the first time an ISDS claim against the EU as a whole due to the unbundling requirement under the recast of the gas directive. And this claim came from a subsidiary company of Gazprom, a Russian state-owned gas company, which is headquartered in Switzerland. So you see, Russia is no longer a member. However, if subsidiary company of Russia is headquartered somewhere in one of the ECT countries, they can use this subsidiary company to sue one of the ECT signatories. Then we have Japan, which is an interesting case because Japan is co-chairing the modernization process, and I will come back later on to Japan. There are 3 investors from Japan who are suing Spain for changes in their incentive schemes for renewable energy generation. When we look at more in details, the 130 ISDS claims that are known, I put here known because the ECT does not require the states nor the investors to make the information about the ISDS claims known. So most probably we have more ISDS claims that we are not aware of. But when we look at the 130 that are known, we see that less than half have been awarded so far. And when we look the proceedings, the details of the proceedings, it looks like 39% were in favor of investor and 39% were in favor of state. However, we need to keep in mind that the state, even when the final decision is in favor of states need to pay. It's not zero cost for taxpayers because states need to pay for the legal and arbitration fees, which are estimated at 4.5 million, which means that, and this applies also in settled ones, discontinued one, another party. This means even in this part, which is a big part, and states, there is a cost for the taxpayer, so it's not free of cost. So that's why the ECT became a real threat for public finance, as what we see here is that most of the ISDS cases, more than half, are from the claimants are transnational corporations and financial institutions. This may explain why Netherlands is has the highest number of is hosting the highest number of claimants, because Netherlands offers generous tax incentives for transnational corporations. And basically, individual investors and SMEs, taxes paid by these two groups are used to compensate protected privileged foreign investors. And when we look at to the ISDS claims from fuels perspective, from energy perspective, energy sources perspective, given that the ECT does not distinguish between different energy sources, but it eliminates energy saving as an energy source, even if it recognizes it as a source. So most of ISDS, 3/4 of the ISDS claims are related to electricity contracts or electricity deals. And within the electricity deals, we have, given that there is no distinction between energy sources, most of them are related to solar energy production due to changes in incentives, because the ECT does not explicitly grant to governments the right to regulate. And this is really problematic. This is what explains the 88 ISDS claims against EU countries. So basically, in more than 20 years of existence of ECT, the treaty failed in meeting its three main objectives: the political one, the economic one, and the energy security one. However, the ECT became a threat to public finance and to the rights for government to regulate. And in 2009, with the withdrawal of Russia, ECT signatories decided to start modernization process. This is where the process was launched. And today, in 2020, starting from April, we will have 3 rounds of negotiations, 4 days of negotiations. And by the end of the process, they are aiming to have an agreement on the policy options to adopt in December. We see that it's a lengthy process of more than 10 years. And to assess if the process, if the modernization process has been an efficient process or not, we should compare this to the process that has led to the International Renewable Energy Agency. It started almost the same year, and today the International Renewable Energy Agency has almost 200 members, while in the case of the ECT during this period, we had the withdrawal of Russia and Italy, and the accession of Afghanistan, Montenegro, Yemen, and Jordan. These 4 countries are not big players in the global energy dialogue, especially when we consider the climate emergency. So basically, the modernization process has not been as efficient as we may think. 3 major things happened in the modernization process. First thing is the development of the expansion, the consolidation, expansion, and outreach policy called Connexo policy. I will come back to this later because this policy aims to extend the ECT to outside the traditional Eurasian countries. After the withdrawal of Russia, the objective was to replace Russia with its fossil fuel reserves with developing countries who have important fossil fuel reserves. The second important thing that happened during the modernization process is the adoption of the International Energy Charter. This International Energy Charter is a political declaration. It's not binding at all. However, it became the first step to enter for countries to be part of the ECT process, actually, of the Energy Charter process. And the IEC, we have only 51 signatories, which means, again, it's not a very big success. We have less signatories of the International Energy Treaty than the Charter than the treaty itself, which shows that it's not a big success. However, the International Energy Charter attracted newcomers as observers, which are from the developing countries. So these two are really linked. And then finally, in 2018, ECT signatories agreed on the list of modernization topics, in total 25, and this is what we will discuss after this slide. And then in 2019, the contracting parties proposed policy options for negotiations. So the 25 identified modernization topics were discussed by contracting parties, and you see, you have seen before that the modernization process has been is a lengthy one, more than 10 years. However, when we look at the policy options proposed by countries, we realize that only these countries, 7 countries, are interested. Well, actually. 8 countries plus the EU representing its 28 member states, and our colleagues from the Commission will clarify about the UK and the Italian case, and have proposed policy options. This means that at least 40% of the ECT signatories, all what is colored here are ECT signatories, are not interested by the modernization. They are not active in the modernization process. And when you look at just the number of policy options proposed, Japan looks like the champion by proposing policy options for each of the topics. However, Japan proposed for each of the topics to keep the current ECT provisions as they are. Japan is an interesting case study because it's a G20 country. However, Japan so far is not facing any ISDS case, and we have more and more Japanese investors investing in the EU, mainly in electricity production through renewables, and we already have 3 ISDS cases led by Japanese investors. Now, when we look at what are the instruments that ECT signatories have in their hands to make changes in the treaty, there are 4, and there are differences between these instruments. Clarification and declaration are non-binding instruments, while protocols and amendments are binding instruments. This is the first difference, it's the legal status. The second big major difference is the voting rules. Declaration and protocols require 3/4 majority to be voted. However, amendments require unanimity vote. And when we look at the options proposed, we see that for 23 out of 25 modernization topics, active contracting parties propose to amend the treaty, which is, as you are going to see, going to be very challenging because of the gaps between these countries, between the ECT countries. Now, out of the 25 modernization topics and the policy options that have been proposed, 3 major issues that are raised, that have been raised after 2 decades of ECT existence are not on negotiating tables. So the phase out of binding protection of foreign investment in fossil and unsustainable fuels, fossil fuels and nuclear, because we have some ISDS cases related to nuclear. Has not been proposed by any of the contracting parties, not even the EU and its member states. And then there is no ISDS, which is very controversial, is not going to be discussed, reformed under the ECT, because we have ongoing discussion to reform the ISDS under the UN, and our colleagues from the Commission will update us on this. Similarly, despite the fact that we have 83 intra-EU disputes, it's not going to be discussed. How to solve the intra-EU disputes is not going to be discussed under the ECT, and our colleagues from the Commission, I'm sure, will update us on this. Now, why it is problematic that these 3 main issues are not raised by the ECT? I will start with the first one, which is the phase out of investment protection of fossil fuels. Based on the policy options proposed by the contracting parties, we have been able to design different modernization scenarios from climate perspective. The first scenario that we see here is based on the Japanese no changes in each of 25 modernization topics. In this case, by 2050, the cumulative emissions protected by the ECT protects fossil fuels, foreign investment in fossil fuels. By doing that, the ECT protects, it means that the ECT protects foreign emissions in carbon emissions. And in the Japanese scenario, if the end point will be the Japanese position, this means that more than 1/3 of the remaining EU carbon budget will be protected by 2050 by the ECT. And if we go to the options, if we put together all the options proposed by other countries, the EU, Turkey, Azerbaijan, etc., then we will end up, and we call this trade scenario because this is these policy options are driven only by trade experts. And in this case, we will have almost 5 times the remaining EU carbon budget protected by the ECT by 2050. We see that these 2 options are no-go options from climate perspective. And then the third option is that we phase out, contracting parties decide to phase out protection of foreign investment in fossil fuels. In this case, the emission protected by the ECT will be limited to those that are already protected by the ECT, basically limited to the investment made in the last 20 years. In this case, even in this case, the ECT is not going to be carbon neutral, because the ECT is already protecting emissions, and these emissions will stay in the air. However, contracting parties have the power to limit the ecocide effect of the ECT to almost 3 times the EU remaining carbon budget. So basically, the choice from climate perspective is almost 3 times the EU remaining carbon budget, almost 5 times, or more than 1/3 of the global remaining carbon budget. And then the fact that ECT, the continuation of the protection of foreign investment in fossil fuels will have another impact, which is financial impact. Because given the carbon neutrality, fossil fuel investment will have infrastructure will have to retire earlier than the time frame that is usually considered for this kind of installations, and otherwise, and this means that we will have more stranded fossil fuel assets protected by the ECT. And the standard fossil fuel assets protected by the ECT would potentially reach 2.15 trillion by 2050 if fossil fuel protection is kept. And then the other financial impact that the ECT will have is the cost of ISDS cases, for example, in the EU countries. Where we already have plans to phase out coal, for example, and I guess plans to phase out oil and gas will come in this decade. And the total cost of ISDS would reach 1.3 trillion by 2050. What we have to keep in mind to have a reference is that the EU, the estimate of the investment need for the EU European Green Deal is 1 trillion over the next 10 years. So basically, the financial cost of the ECT by keeping ISDS and by keeping fossil fuels is going to be at least 3 times the financial need for the European Green Deal. So now, can we realistically achieve, could the contracting parties realistically achieve an agreement to phase out investment protection of fossil fuels? Unfortunately, the answer is no, because we have important gaps in ECT constituency in terms of progress towards carbon neutrality. And remember, as I explained, to be able to phase out fossil fuels, they will need to amend the treaty, and to amend the treaty, they will need unanimity vote of all the contracting parties participating to the process. And what we see here are the countries that are making income out of fossil fuels. So realistically, these countries are not going to agree to phase out the protection of fossil fuels, especially when we look at all these countries except Norway. They do not have a carbon neutrality target yet. So it's unfortunate, but these countries, the phasing out fossil fuel protection works against the economic interest of these countries, despite the fact that, as we have seen before, there is the flow of energy investment in these countries is not expected from the ECT, did not take place. And the other reason why it will be very difficult to reach this agreement is the fact that fossil fuel industry, who is one of the beneficiaries of the ECT, is not yet investing in renewable and clean energy solutions. As we see here from the latest IEA data, in 2019, investment in renewables and CCS was less than 1%. Fossil fuel industry is still investing mainly in fossil fuels. This means that this industry is going to use all the means possible to keep the status quo of the ECT. Now, what does that mean, keeping the status quo of the ECT? It will probably mean that the expansion policy that I mentioned earlier in the modernization process will continue under the ECT. The continuation of this policy is going to be a global disaster, because countries targeted by the ECT are countries like Mauritania and Nigeria, which are countries with high reserves of fossil fuels. And these countries face lack of energy access, and they need to provide access to energy for their citizens. And basically, if the accession of these countries take place, this means that these countries will be locked in carbon and at a high cost, because these countries, we already have an issue in European countries on defending ourselves against the arbitral tribunals in the ISDS cases, and these countries lack technical capacity to be able to defend themselves. What we see here is are the countries based on the progress made in the accession process. There are different phases in the accession process, and in total, on average, it takes 7 years to become an ECT signatory. And I guess Marcel will tell us more about how the UN could intervene to make sure to avoid that the ECT, that the developing countries, is not going to be locked in the ECT. Now, when we talk about carbon neutrality, we very often think at the global level that this is something that needs to happen only in the EU. This is completely wrong, because all the countries who have ratified the Paris Agreement, and all ECT countries have ratified the Paris Agreement, all these countries need to be carbon neutral. And very often politicians talk about carbon neutrality by 2050. For example, in the EU, the target that is under discussion is for 2050. However, based on the EU carbon budget and our cumulative emissions, the EU should be carbon neutral by 2033. So much earlier than what is under negotiation in the EU. Importantly, all the ECT countries that you see here, they all have to become carbon neutral before 2050, all of them. This means when you have the plan to become carbon neutral, this means you need to have plan to phase out fossil fuels, and the phase out fossil fuels must happen earlier than what we ever thought before. And this gap, actually, in ECT constituency, is going to be a major barrier to the modernization of the treaty if the phase out of the treaty of fossil fuels is taken into account. To wrap up, it is given the gaps between in the implementation of the Paris Agreement domestically between ECT constituency, given the fact that we need to amend the treaty to phase out fossil fuels from the ECT, and given that to amend the treaty we need unanimity vote among all the ECT signatories, it is therefore unlikely that the modernization process would lead to a treaty that is environmental friendly and working for the just energy transition. And the first countries who will be challenged by this fake modernization of the ECT are the EU and its member states, because the EU and its member states decided in December to phase out the use of public finance for domestic investment in fossil fuels. But at the same time, in December, the EU and its member states entered into negotiations of the ECT without proposing to phase out in foreign protection of foreign investment in fossil fuels. So basically, what we are going to face starting from 2021 is that public money, European public money, will not be used anymore for fossil fuels domestically. However, we protect foreign investment in Europe in fossil fuels. This is not going to work. That's the EU and its member states are going to be the first ones to face this contradiction. And the continuation of the ECT is therefore a real threat for Europe's Green Deal, because Europe's Green Deal aims at making Europe carbon neutral by 2050. It's also a threat to the energy transition. As I mentioned earlier, the cost of the ISDS is very high for taxpayers. And globally, if the ECT continues, this means that it will be extended to developing countries, and it will be global climate disaster. Therefore, the only option left for the EU and its member states is to withdraw collectively from the ECT. It's important that we get out altogether, because by getting out altogether, and preferably with countries from the European Free Trade Area, which means Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, then these countries could agree the Europeans could agree between themselves to end intra-EU dispute under the inherited from the ECT regime, and they could also agree to end the survival clause of the intra-EU investment. The survival clause is a clause which makes the investment made before withdrawing from the ECT protected for 20 years more, and this is what scares actually governments from withdrawal perspective, and I think Amandine will say a few words about that. That's all from my side. Thank you for your attention. The report is available at the link below, and I give the floor now to Rod Johnson from Energy in Demand, who will moderate the roundtable discussion.
Thanks, Yamina. Hello, everybody. You see how complicated this whole topic is. We have, we're running a little short of time, but because of the Paris Agreement, because of our energy union, because of our clean energy package, because of our European Green Deal, Europe is on a whole different wavelength than what's happening with the European or the Energy Charter. I was a consultant to it for 10 years, and when it first started, never thinking anything like this would ever happen, but it has, and something has to happen. I'd like to just raise some questions now we've got two panelists from the European Commission. We have Sylvia Ball from the Deputy Head of Unit in the Investment Unit of DG Trade. We also have Chiara Galifa, who's a legal officer at DG Trade. So I'm going to ask some questions about what's going on from the point of view from the Commission, and I don't know which one of you will answer. I'll leave that up to you.
Hello, Rod.
Hello. I could see one of you had a green microphone, so I knew that one of you at least was there. But Yamina raised the issue about Italy, but we've also got just what's happened 2 weeks ago, this situation with the UK and Brexit. And the negotiating directives were adopted in the mid last year. Can you please clarify the current status of the UK? Can you also clarify the status of Italy? Again, Yamina just raised it. Do the negotiations pertain to them or not?
Rod, first of all, thanks a lot for inviting us. I'm sitting here with Chiara, and we're very happy to reply to your questions on this. So maybe let me start by replying to your question in relation to the UK. So during the transition period, you know that we have in the withdrawal agreement a transition period, which is now until the end of this year, but it can be prolonged. But during this transition period, the UK is to be treated as a member state and remains bound by EU law, including the international agreements to which the EU is a party, so also the ECT. But what is interesting here is that the UK is also a member of the ECT in its own right, and therefore, after the transition period, it will remain bound by the ECT. Okay. Let me turn to Italy. So Italy, as you said, withdrew from the ECT in 2015. So it is no longer an individual member of the ECT. But Italy is a member of the European Union. And as the European Union is a member of the ECT, it's fair to say that Italy is indirectly still covered by the ECT through its EU membership.
Okay. So why did they withdraw anyway then?
Well, there is an official explanation to this, and that was that they did it in light of a general policy review in relation to spendings for international organizations.
Okay. Now, Yamina also mentioned about the modernization process, and it's interesting that that process started 10 years after the charter actually got going. But as we heard today, phasing out fossil fuel investment protection is not one of the options proposed by the EU, which will jeopardize Europe's carbon neutrality target. At the same time, the European Investment Bank its energy lending policy includes phasing out domestic investments in fossil fuels. Will this be adjusted in the future to align EU domestic policies with the ECT?
Thanks, Rob, for giving us an opportunity to also comment on that request, which was made by Yamina. And I think it is important that we start by saying that the ECT, as it stands today, is outdated, and it is of concern to us and to the member states. And the objective of greening the ECT is really at the heart of the entire modernization process. If you have a look at our negotiation directives, you can find there so clear references to this greening objective. It says the modernized ECT should reflect climate change and clean energy transition goals and contribute to the achievement of the objective of the Paris Agreement. And how we are trying to achieve this is by, let's say, mainly first trying to really increase the right to regulate of the governments. And Yamina mentioned that for the moment, this is not explicitly mentioned in the ECT treaty. And it is high time that this is included there. And also other, let's say, more technical adjustments to make sure that the right to regulate of governments is fully safeguarded. And then we want to include in the binding part robust provisions on sustainable development. So that will be the two main avenues. So why not having an upfront exclusion of certain economic activities from the scope of investment protection? This is something that we have avoided as a general policy line. And you may remember that we had a similar discussion in the past about tobacco products, like a tobacco carve-out. But it is indeed because investment protection provisions are basic guarantees that should be available to all legal investments. I mean, certainly governments should be able to protect legitimate policy interests by making some activities or products illegal if they think this is necessary. And they should be able to regulate them to ensure that the level of protection of the public interest is adequate. And this is exactly what is at the heart of the objective of the EU's reform on investment protection. So to ensure that governments can regulate properly. But we think that governments should not be able, for instance, to expropriate without compensation an investor that conducts a legal activity and complies with all the standards set by that government. So from our point of view, the ECT's investment and sustainability rules need to be modernized to allow for effective regulation rather than denying basic protection to an investor that has legally established its activity.
Right. Okay, well, thank you. It gets more complicated all the time. Now, ISDS reform is not one of the identified 25 modernization topics of the ECT, as ISDS reform is taking place under the UN umbrella and goes far beyond the ECT. In these UN discussions, the EU is proposing a multilateral investment court. Can you please update the audience about the progress made on these discussions?
Hi, Rod. This is Chiara, and thank you. Hi, and thank you very much for giving us indeed the opportunity to update you about this process. So indeed, we are pursuing a multilateral reform of ISDS, and the objectives of this process indeed is to make this system more legitimate, more independent, impartial, transparent, reduce costs, being able to correct errors in the decision, and increase the legal certainty and predictability. And for those who are not very familiar with this process, this is a process that has been taking place at the level of the United Nations. And it has gone through 3 phases. The first phase was the identification of concerns. The second was a phase where countries had to say whether the reform is desirable. And the third phase, and this is the phase where we are now, is to develop concrete solutions. So we are now in this third phase, and the Multilateral Working Group 3 has agreed last year to devote the same amount of time to structural reforms, which means the creation of a multilateral permanent court, and to other non-structural reforms, like, for instance, coming up with a code of conduct for the arbitrators. And the last meeting of the working group took place in January 2020, where the UN members spent a full week to discuss structural reform, in particular from the angles of creating an appeal mechanism, or creating a multilateral investment court, and other issues such as the selection and appointment of the adjudicators. And now the working group has instructed the Secretariat of UNCITRAL to prepare draft textual proposal, which will capture the different options. And this would allow the working group to have more detailed discussions on these issues in autumn 2020.
Okay, thanks.
We are, of course, I mean, this is a process that we feel confident in. We feel that this is a good forum for discussion, for the creation of a multilateral court, because, in particular, because it's a very transparent process and it's a very inclusive process. We have, of course, as you know, we have a mandate from the member states to establish a multilateral court, and we see we are now engaged in this discussion, and we'll see now where this is going to lead us.
Well, seems like a very interesting process, and I hope it keeps going. We talk about multilateral, but we're also just looking at inside the EU, the intra-EU disputes is quite an interesting thing. And the continuation of the ECT is likely mean the continuation of intra-EU disputes under the ECT regime, not under anything to do with the EU did not propose any policy option to end intra-EU disputes under the ECT regime. Can you please share with the audience, one of you, I'm not sure which one, your views on the inter-EU disputes under the ECT, and if the historic decision of ending the bilateral investment treaty following the ACME ruling of the ECG apply to the ECT? Sorry for all these acronyms.
Look, the Commission has indeed a view on the intra-EU application of the ECT, and this view is public. We set it out in a communication which was issued, if I'm not wrong, in 2018 on the protection of intra-EU investment. And the views of the Commission is that in light of the Court of Justice ruling in ACMEA, recourse to intra-EU litigation under DCT is incompatible with EU law, and the Commission is also systematically representing this position before the arbitration tribunals in the intra-EU cases. So we systematically intervene as amicus curiae before the arbitral tribunals to set out these views. And most of the member states indeed agree also with the EU and support this position. Now, I have to say that the issue of the intra-EU litigation under DCT is, if you want, a sort of unintended consequence which originates from a misinterpretation of DCT by the arbitration tribunal. This issue, sooner or later, will be settled. Either because there might be an agreement between the member states, or because the Court of Justice will have to rule on these questions if there is a question coming from national courts. But of course, it's not possible at this stage to say when and whether this will happen.
And if I may add something on this point here, Yamina was saying the European Union did not even make a proposal in this regard in the modernization process. But we really think that this is not the right forum to solve an intra-EU issue. I don't think personally that with Kazakhstan and the other contracting parties around the table, this will help us in finding a good internal solution. So we need to find a solution with the member states in the forum where this belongs to.
Okay, that sounds quite good. Now, finally, I know we're asking a lot of questions to the Commission representatives, but this is quite crucial. Yamina is in the final slide, she's proposing a multilateral withdrawal of the EU and its member states, which would, according to her, allow them to bring disputes under the European Court of Justice and end the survival clause. I know you talked about the greening of the ECT, but there have been two motions of the European Parliament on the Green Deal from the Greens and the left have also been included in this proposal. So about just unilateral or multilateral withdrawal. What are your views on this proposal?
Yeah, on this one. So first of all, I think just to get this clear, a collective withdrawal of the Union and the member states would trigger the sunset clause under the ECT with all external contracting parties. So that means that existing investments would still be protected under the old unreformed rules for another 20 years. Of course, if there would be a good combination and member states could agree on the intra-EU termination, then maybe it could be discussed whether this would end the sunset clause within the EU member states, but this would need to be explored. But it is clear that with all external partners, the sunset clause would be triggered. So therefore, instead of now triggering the sunset clause, our preferred solution is first to try to modernize the ECT and to engage into negotiations with the contracting parties. And we think that the best way forward is not to simply walk out of an international agreement without seriously engaging into a reform process. But we need to be clear that if this modernization process fails, after a serious collective effort, the Commission will need to have a discussion with the member states on the remaining options, including collecting withdrawal. For me, it's just that the order is important. First, we need to try to modernize from within, as this would really ensure the better result, meaning an ECT which is fit for its purpose in times of clean energy transition. And if this is not possible, we will have a collective discussion with member states about all other options, including the withdrawal.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we've mentioned the European Parliament, and I'd like to introduce Ms. Anna Cavazzini, who's a member of Parliament and who's a member of the International Trade Committee for the Greens EFA group, and she chairs the Investment Monitoring Group. Obviously, this is getting Anna. One of the motions that I referred to in my last question, representative, related to the motion from the Greens calling for a multilateral withdrawal. Now, we've just heard what the Commission has said. Can you please update us on the discussions in the European Parliament on the collective withdrawal?
Hello, I hope you can understand me well.
Yes, fine.
Perfect. Yeah, hello from Strasbourg. We are now in the plenary week. As to the position of the European Parliament, at the moment we have the situation that in the past term there was already like a very clear position by the European Parliament on the question of the Energy Charter Treaty and a very strong position on investments, fossil fuels investments should not be covered by any special investment protection rights. This Parliament is new. So at the moment, it is also about like 2/3 of the parliamentarians are new. I see my role as rapporteur or standing rapporteur and head of this new monitoring group on investment to also do some information, to reach out to new MEPs, to explain them the topic, because of course it is a very, very important topic, but if you talk to ordinary parliamentarians, for them it's a very nerdy topic. So at the moment I try to reach out to other MEPs to explain them the problem, to show them what are the options for the European Parliament to do, and this mainly happens via this new monitoring group that had been established, but it also of course happens via events that we will be organizing, and so on and so on. And I have the feeling from the discussions that we had so far, also with the Commission and with some colleagues, that for us, or like an avenue of the Parliament could be to support the modernization process by setting a clear timeline. And I would also say the timeline should not be very, very long. And then saying if there's no progress on the modernization, we should demand like a really clear end of the Energy Charter Treaty, or like a collective withdrawal, as you call it.
Well, with the new Parliament, it's certainly a lot of work to do. So, I mean, you said that with so many new members, there's a lack of awareness of the issues or lack of understanding. I mean, how do we get Yamina's message, her report? People are not going to, most members of Parliament are not going to read this long report. What's the best way we can get a lot of those messages across? It could be better understood.
Yeah. As I said, the biggest forum, I guess, is like the monitoring group, where a lot of MEPs from the Inter are taking part. We are also planning a kind of public event. I think it's important to really also try to get MEPs not only from the Trade Committee, but for example also from the ITRE, like the Industry Committee, and other committees involved, because in fact it does not only concern investment, it also concerns energy, it concerns climate. So I think also the MEPs who are in the ENVI committee and other committees should be involved in that. I think it's important that academia, like you, like NGOs, and so on, reach out to a high number of MEPs to also explain the topic, and yeah, for example, sending the report with a short whatever summary to a lot of MEPs. I think it is important to create, because we are really at the beginning at the moment, to create some knowledge about it and some noise about it, and that's quite good. I personally also try to get in touch with the member states. I asked the Croatian presidency, for example, on this question of termination of the intra-EU part of the Energy Charter Treaty, because as the Commission said already, it is not so easy. I also agree that probably within the Energy Charter Treaty, this is not the right avenue, because there are so many non-EU states involved. I think the termination of the intra-EU bits is a very first important step in the reform, and this could be done without the other Energy Charter Treaty members. But of course, there it is really, really important to also talk to and convince the member states who are at the moment skeptical of that, and working towards a solution. I mean, one solution could be, and I think Belgium is thinking about it, asking the European Court of Justice on a clear opinion on that. Another idea is having like a kind of another international treaty that just says we terminate the intra-EU area of the Energy Charter Treaty, and another option is like a declaration by the EU member states, but I had been told by some legal experts that this would probably not be recognized by the arbitrators. So I think this like intra-EU bit is also a very important reform area, but it's not directly within the Energy Charter Treaty reform negotiations.
But anyway, you just used the word negotiations. How much does the European Parliament get involved in negotiations? It's my understanding, maybe I'm wrong, that the modernized ECT must be ratified by the European Parliament as well as the national parliaments. As we talked about, some of the member states are members of on their own right. Are you working with national parliaments on this issue or not yet?
First part of your question is how much are we involved? I mean, it's like with all international processes and treaties and negotiations that the Parliament, the European Parliament, is of course not unfortunately, not sitting at the negotiation table. So it's the Commission which is negotiating, I guess also the member states, because also the member states are members of the Energy Charter Treaty. And we are getting regular updates in form of this monitoring group. We had already one meeting. We're going to have another one in March, I believe. And then the Commission is regularly updating us about the progress. And of course, the Parliament can always have like a report on initiative report or resolution on that. Like this is always then non-binding, but during the process, we can have actually a non-binding resolution, which has, of course, high political value, but it's not legally binding. And we are also exploring the avenue of the Parliament already, like in the summer or early summer and spring, having some resolution on the Energy Charter Treaty in order to also really push for the reform and for, if necessary, for the exit at the end. And the national member states, sorry, we are a little bit, I mean, I guess all European parliamentarians try also to be in contact with their respective national parliamentarians. And yeah, I'm, for example, in contact with the Green MPs, but I don't have any contact to other parliamentarians at the moment.
Okay, thank you so much. Now let's cross the Atlantic to New York. Marcel, I believe you're in New York. Marcel Allers is an experienced development professional, having worked his entire career in development assistance. During these years, he's worked in the field mainly in Africa for NGOs, research institutes, the African Development Bank, and currently with the UN Development Program. Marcel, I don't know how familiar the UN is with the ECT, and if the UNDP has working relationships with the Energy Charter Secretariat, given that the expansion of the ECT targets to developing countries covered by UNDP. You have to be unmuted.
Yeah, I just did it. Thanks. Okay. Thanks, Rob. Yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity to say a few words. Yeah, so the answer is no. I mean, at least not as far as I know. I don't think we have any formal relationship, working relationship with the Energy Charter Secretariat. So, therefore, you know, we have not been involved, formally at least, in any of these questions related to the expansion that is ongoing in trying to sign up new countries, in particular developing countries, which is obviously what our mandate is. That has not happened yet. Now, we are very concerned, of course, and this part of the presentation is obviously what attracts our attention. I have to say that the awareness, the knowledge of the existence of this treaty, let alone exactly all the details, it's just not there. At least that's my feeling. I personally didn't know about it and only learned about it last year. And when I ask around in my community and other practitioners, I'm, you know, surprised by the lack of awareness about it. As I said, its very existence, let alone all these details that now raise alarm. And so, in my view, it's particularly important as a first step to raise that public awareness, to make people aware of the treaty, its details, what it is supposed to do, what it does in practice, and in particular, you know, in the current context, where it looks like the treaty can be a serious barrier towards the climate objectives that we all have signed up to. And that's what I'm trying to do, and you know, first internally, making our officers aware, and so now that I know sort of the countries that are being targeted, we could try to get involved, by trying to, raise that awareness and make the governments aware of the full, how you call it, the full implications of signing up, so that they get, if you like, more neutral or advice about what they're about to sign up to. Because I can see, the kind of pitch that would be made to those countries in terms of its advantages. A lot of these countries, they crave more investment for their economies. And, and I can see how they could easily be seduced.
On that very point, the new report provides evidence that development funds, mainly from the EU, have been used for the expansion policy of the ECT. So this is the countries that the UNDP covers. Yamina considers rightly that this will lock developing countries into carbon at a high cost given the ISDS mechanism. Were you aware of the use, for example, of the EU Sustainable Energy for All technical facility for the expansion of the ECT?
No, I was not aware of that. Yamina told me recently, and I was indeed quite amazed that, it seems like this is really not what we want these kind of funds to be used for. This is entirely counterproductive. We are going to great lengths. Our whole mission, our whole objective is to accompany and to support developing countries in the economic development, and in my case, in particular with the energy sector development, addressing issues of energy access. Many of these countries don't even have, their populations don't even have full access, but also in doing so, increasingly in a way that is environmentally sustainable. And therefore, we make very great efforts to ensure that our advice given on the development of the energy sector is fully aligned with climate objectives. And to avoid that these countries lock themselves into a development path that's based on fossil fuels, which is what we see happening in many countries. Yeah.
It also looks like we should be raising this at the next climate conference in Glasgow in November. So
yeah, for me, indeed, the topic is of great importance.
Yeah.
And as I said, the first thing in my view is to bring this out in the open, so that there can be a public debate about this. Because right now it seems to be operating largely in the shadows. And this is in nobody's interest, in my view.
Now, our final panelist is Amandine Vandenberg, and she's a lawyer with Client Earth. And I don't know how many of you know Client Earth, but if you don't, go Google it. It's one of the best organizations to really promote sustainability in everything we're doing. Amandine is a lawyer in the Trade and Environment group at Client Earth. And I should say that Client Earth is an environmental law charity, which makes it quite an unusual work. Amandine's work focuses on reforming the investment protection regime, in particular ISDS, and tackling the threats posed by the Energy Charter Treaty on environment and climate policies. Now, Amandine, I'm going to throw you probably the toughest question of all. Yamina, the European Parliament and civil society have all been proposing a multilateral withdrawal of the EU and its member states from the ECT. From your perspective, what are the legal challenges of such a proposal?
Hey, hi, Howard. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me and give me the opportunity to comment on this very interesting topic, and for asking me this question. Because we're a little bit delayed, I'll try to answer as clearly and concisely as possible in a couple of minutes. And I will raise 3 points. Some have been already touched upon already by the Commission and from the Parliament. My first point concerns the greening approach of the European Commission for the modernization. On this, my main thought is that the EU, the member states, should actually reflect on what is it that they are trying to achieve and what is it that they're trying to protect because modernizing the ECT with clearer rules and better protection of states' right to regulate, and even a reformed ISDS version, as the EU is proposing also internationally, I mean, they're all great improvement of the current regime, but these are not going to solve the problem that the ECT and other investment treaties are simply not the right tool to promote and attract foreign direct investment in renewables. And that's what we need today to face the climate emergency. All the ECT parties are signatories to the Paris Agreement, so I think it would be a really great opportunity for the EU to act as a global leader and be coherent with its internal policies on climate and the Green New Deal, and try to convince other parties to lead it all together. But that's a tricky process, and indeed, if this process doesn't lead anywhere, the only option that is left, and I fully support this option, is to leave and withdraw from the treaty. The real issue has been already highlighted by the Commission and the Parliament. It's when you withdraw, you terminate an investment treaty, and the ECT, such as the ECT, well, it triggers this special clause, the sunset clause. And that's particularly problematic in the case of the ECT, because it means that all the existing investment in the energy sector, and that's including the currently exploited fossil fuel resources, infrastructure, and other assets that are becoming increasingly at risk of becoming stranded, they will continue to be protected, and investors will continue to be allowed to bring claims. So clearly, that's probably the big issue is the sunset clause. If the EU and the member states withdraw and they remain protected, they remain exposed to the risk that fossil fuel companies will attempt to shift the risk onto states and obtain compensation for these assets. So yeah, I mean, it's already been touched upon by the Commission that if they withdraw, I mean, if the EU and the member states withdraw, you have to deal with both the EU and the external partners. I think in the meantime, the EU should try to explore the options that they already have available to make an interstate agreement and deal with the legal effects of the sunset clause among themselves. So that's my main point on that, and I will end up here because I will soon have to leave. Thanks again for giving us to contribute on that.
Thank you. Well, we all have to leave. I'd like to thank Sylvia, Chiara, Anna, Marcel, and yourself, Amandine. I think we've raised a lot of points. I will end this panel. Thank you so much. I know we're way over time, and but I will leave that, Vicky, to you, and maybe Yamina, but over to you.
Yeah, great, and thank you, Ron. And I just want to say I do realize we did go over, but I think it was very well worth it to hear from all of these expert panelists and to get a full understanding of the report presented by Yamina. It was an outstanding presentation, and before we adjourn, I would like to ask Yamina if she does have any final remarks to provide.
Yes, thank you, Vicky. I would like to answer about the sunset clause point that was raised by the Commission and by Amandine. Actually, given that foreign direct investment in the EU are mainly EU investment, are mainly from investors within the EU. So this means that we have 67% of this investment, at least 67%, that are from EU investors. This means, and if we consider the EFTA countries, Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Switzerland, this goes to up to 80% of the foreign investment in the EU. This means that by withdrawing altogether, the sunset clause would potentially apply only to 20% of foreign investment that are from non-EU countries. And these two non-EU countries investing in the EU are mainly Australia and Japan, which I guess we could deal with differently. So that's why I would really recommend that we do not lock ourselves for more years in this treaty because of the sunset clause, because there is, I don't see any way on how to negotiate getting rid of the sunset clause under the ECT regime. Thank you. Over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Yamina. Excellent point. I just really would like to close by extending a hearty thank you to all of our expert panelists and also to our attendees who participated in today's webinar. We very much appreciate your participation, and we hope you found today's webinar valuable and you are taking away good information that is helpful to you. So just a quick reminder that a short survey will pop up on your screen after we end the webinar, and I really appreciate if you could take a minute or two to answer the survey questions. It's very short. It should take only a minute or so. So with that, again, thank you to everyone. I send you all good wishes, and this concludes our webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.